Whenever someone makes an assertion of spiritual truth, you, as the hearer, have a responsibility to ask two questions. The first question is, how do you know that? And the second question is, how can I verify that? Now, if the person speaking is of a religious turn of mind, the answer to your first question, how do you know that, is going to be very murky. He's going to tell you about some feeling he had during some event, and that's when it all became clear to him. So obviously your second question, how can I verify that, isn't going to get any answer at all, because he doesn't know how to verify it. He never thought he had to. He'll invite you to go to a similar event and see if you have the same experience. That's what he'll do. Thomas Huxley, one of the great scientists of the 19th century, big supporter of Darwin's theory of natural selection, once said, "It is wrong for someone to say they are certain of the truth of a given proposition unless they can present evidence that logically justifies that certainty." 21st century translation, put up or shut up. If you can't prove it, don't go around telling people it's true, because if you can't prove it, how do you know it's true? Now, back in the days when I was teaching midweek classes, if I wanted to mess with my students' heads, purely for my own amusement, I'd start off the class by saying, tell me about the infinite. Tell me about God. What are its characteristics? And someone would say, God is love right away, and God is intelligence, and God is healing, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'd say, how about infinite? Is God infinite? And everybody would nod their head, oh, yes, 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 God is infinite. Everybody knows that. And I'd say, okay, so you're telling me God is infinite. How do you know that? You never saw so many blank stares. One guy said, because you told us it was, Gregory. And, he was kidding. But no, I'm sure he was kidding. But, we throw this term around, the infinite. Where do we get off calling it the infinite? How do we know it's infinite? Maybe we shouldn't be calling it the infinite. Maybe we should be calling it the undoubtedly very large. I mean, you can't go out back with a yardstick and measure it, so what do? Well, here's what you do. You use your rational faculties to figure out how an infinite being would behave, and then see if this thing that we're calling the infinite behaves that way. Now, spoiler alert, it does behave that way because it is infinite, but me telling you that really isn't enough. Sooner or later, that's a proposition you're going to have to sort out on your own for yourself. Now, for the next couple of minutes, you're going to think you've wandered into some god-awful freshman year philosophy class, no doubt taught by a professor who's read everything and understood nothing. But I'm making a massively important point about you as an individual that you really need to understand, so bear with me a second. Now, the thing about infinity is that it never ends. It just keeps going forever. It has no boundary. Now, that's something we cannot wrap our tiny little human brains around. That's just too much for us. We can understand it in an abstract kind of way, but we can't really experience infinity in our minds. We're just not built for that. But infinity would, by definition, contain all time and all space. It would contain everything that is and ever was and ever will be. It would contain everything that is known, has been known, or ever will be known. And it would have to be completely serene and complete, because it would lack for nothing, because, it's everything. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, only the finite has suffered and struggled. The infinite lies stretched in smiling repose. Now, if you were raised religiously, maybe you think of God as being present everywhere, kind of, looking over everybody's shoulders. But you don't think of everything as being made out of the substance of the infinite. Or maybe you think of God like a layer of peanut butter that's spread out across the universe. It clumps up over here and thins out over there. That's not a joke. There's a lot of people who think of God exactly that way. But the minute you think of God plus something else, God stops being infinite. You know, if God and the material world are separate from each other, then there's somewhere where God stops and the material world begins. And if there's somewhere where God stops, then God has a boundary around it and is not infinite. Now, I know that sounds like demented hair splitting, but here's two minor points you need to appreciate about this truth. It means there's no such thing as more God or less God. And it means there's no such thing as being closer to God or farther away from God. You know, every so often somebody comes up to me and says, Gregory, I'm trying to get closer to God. And I say, wow, really? How do you do that? You know, I don't really get how you can get closer to something you're made out of. But anyway, that means there's as much God in a hot dog stand as there is in a cathedral. There's as much God in a bowling alley as there is in the temples of Angkor Wat. Everything is made of the substance of God, including me, including you. That means there is no separation between you and God because you are God being you. You're part of it. Now, here's a very big point that you need to appreciate about this. There is only one power in the world you ever have to deal with. Now, if you're like most people, you think of the world as a conglomeration of different powers all banging up against each other. Government, religion, science, crime, war, disease, misogyny, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia. But all of these powers are simply different manifestations of a single power, a single source. So when the infinite looks at you, it doesn't see this separate entity discrete from itself with your name attached to it. It just sees itself being you. And by definition, an infinite being must always be happy wherever it looks. That means that you are not any higher or any lower in God's estimation than anybody else, because it's not possible to be higher or lower in God's estimation than anybody else. You are not any higher or lower in God's estimation than any tree, any rock, any grasshopper, any star, any subatomic particle, or for that matter, the pile of dog shit you stepped in the other day. I'm sure it's disheartening to think you're on the same spiritual level as a pile of dog shit, but it happens to be true. It is not possible for the infinite to favor one part of itself over another. To do that, God would have to be schizophrenic, you know, likes its right hand, but is not too sure about its left hand, a little dodgy there, you know. Doesn't make any sense. And when you understand this as a truth, all Western religions fall apart at the seams. God knows Christianity does. Now, if you ask a modern-day Christian, what is Christianity about? He will say, Christianity is about love. Christianity has never been about love. Christians talk about love endlessly. You know, when they were in the Middle Ages, when they were riding through the Middle East, sticking swords into Muslims, they were bringing God's love to the Middle East. Christianity is about getting into heaven. That is the brass ring that all Christians are going for, getting into heaven. And the methods, historically, that some Christians have chosen to get themselves into heaven is enough to freeze the blood in your veins. But if you understand that everything is made out of the substance of God, that whole scenario makes no sense anymore. God is disappointed in itself. God is sending itself to hell for all eternity as punishment. God is going to redeem itself so it can send itself to heaven. It doesn't make any sense anymore. Nobody needs to be saved because the infinite is incapable of turning its back on itself. Now, there's nothing you can do for God. It is already complete. There's nothing you can give God that it doesn't already have, or more accurately, there's nothing you can give God that it already isn't. And there's nothing you can show God that it doesn't already know. You are not here in this life to prove something about yourself to God or to pass some kind of test. Because by definition, there would be no reason for an infinite being to pose a test because it would already know the outcome. Yeah. So let me put this to you very simply. Nothing you have ever done has pleased God. And nothing you have ever done has displeased God either. That's not why you're here. And to think of God as some kind of oriental potentate sitting on a throne in the clouds who has to be placated with hymns of adoration and will only do you a solid if you get on your knees and beg for it, is an absolutely blasphemous, offensive concept of God. It is primitive, it is pagan, and it needs to be done away with forever. Isn't that exactly how the ancient pagans thought about their gods? These giant people up in the sky or sitting on mountaintops looking down at us and swooping in once in a while to meddle with things according to an agenda that we know absolutely nothing about. And when the Roman Empire switched over from pagan to Christian, they took the pagan idea of what a god was like and they carried it forward 2,000 years. And now we have people living here in the high-tech 21st century whose concept of God is appropriate to a 3rd century BC goat herder. It's ridiculous. And it needs to go away forever because it's doing a lot of damage. Now, you're a smart person. And as I've been making my argument here, your mind's been running ahead of me. And now you're asking a question. And wow, it's an important question. I mean, it is the question. Now I'm going to finish today by reading a passage from my own book, God, a User's Manual. I won't resort to this text too often because I know how self-serving it looks, but this particular paragraph applies. Why in the world would an infinite, complete, serene, self-contained, infinite being create anything? Why would it create us? What are we doing here? In the next video, I'm going to explain the meaning of life. I'm sure you've been wondering. When you